Good afternoon, viewers. Today I am going to speak on American literature, the basic thing about American literature. American literature is about identity. There is no general theme. Most of the American authors have made identity their focal concern. In Edgar Allan Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, published in 1838, the title character begins his personal story by introducing himself to his readers, supplying both his family name and by describing his father and grandfather. He says, "I am Arthur Gordon Pym." Now, however, before another chapter is through, he renounces home and stows away in an ocean-going vessel. He leaves his home and family and stows away in an ocean-going vessel. And the introduction that had suggested a stable sense of identity, subsequently the later events undercut that stability of identity. Now, Poe was a master of the first-person point of view, which he uses in many of his most famous tales. Now, in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, the first-person voice leads an immediacy to the story and blurs the distinction between the author and the narrator. The three-part name Poe gives to his character, Arthur Gordon Pym, is parallel to Poe's own name, Edgar Allan Poe, and this reinforces the parallelism. Throughout the novel, Poe continues to play with the theme of identity. Augustus, the friend who arranges for Pym to stow away in an ocean-going vessel, could be called his doppelganger or his double. Okay? And the two identities, sometimes the two personalities, blend into one. Now, after mutiny and storm and numerous other harrowing adventures in the ocean-going vessel, the number of survivors come down to only 4. And then these 4, including Pym, Augustus and other 2, realize that they must resort to cannibalism to survive. So they choose their victims by drawing lots. Their fearful repast provides a literal instance of how one personality can be subsumed within another. They cut off heads, feet, head from the body, hands, head, feet, and everything to dehumanize the victim and efface his very identity. But their effort does little to minimize the horror and shame that they feel for doing this deed. Ultimately, Pym gets trapped in his own coffin hideaway for so long that he nearly perishes. So this birth, and rebirth theme, birth, death and rebirth theme or motive occurs recurrently in American literary tradition. Now, next if we look at Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Poe's narrator, we have seen, supplies his Christian name and his family name. But Melville's narrator provides only one name. He says his name is Ishmael. So to call him Ishmael. Okay. So Ishmael is what he chooses to be called, and this name may or may not be his given name. It is neither a family name nor his own name. It may not even be his given name, but he chooses to be called Ishmael, and in that he finds his identity. Now, selecting this name from the Bible, Melville's narrator creates his own identity, and like the biblical Ishmael, he too is an outcast and a wanderer. Despite its rich cultural association, Ishmael's initial sentence sounds like something one person might say upon meeting another person face to face. Melville thus begins by establishing a rapport with the reader, or more precisely, he begins the narrative part of the book in an ingratiating manner. But before that, there are two sections called etymology and extracts, which are of such a daring nature and which present such incoherent mass of information that if the readers can make something out of it, if the readers can understand it, then only they will be able to easily identify with his ingratiating introduction and accept his ingratiating introduction that I am Ishmael, call me Ishmael. Okay. So both these sections challenge the readers, supplying an apparently incoherent mass of information and then forcing them to make sense of it. So if one accepts that, then one can accept this also, that is this rather humble introduction, face-to-face introduction to the reader. Now the next work that we take up in American literature is Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. This originally appeared as part of the first edition of his defining book of verse, Leaves of Grass, published in 1855. This long poem has often been called an epic, but its subject matter differs considerably from an epic. It is definitely not about the growth of a nation or about the birth development of a nation. It dismisses that typical subject of an epic by concentrating on the individual. Yet Whitman also makes himself a representative man, someone who stands for everyone. Perhaps Whitman's use of the individual is not so unusual for a work of American literature. In the United States, the expression of individuality was also an expression of universality. So what I mean to say is that Whitman does not confine himself to the individual, which he introduces at the beginning of the epic, but expands himself to encompass and engulf the universal. So the opening lines of Song of Myself is, these are the lines: I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Now this sounds very egoistic, because the first line is definitely full of blatant egoism and it tends to put off. And then the second line, what I assume you shall assume, this sentence is also egoistic and antagonistic. Who is he to say, what I assume you shall assume? And then the poem's third line, which concludes the opening sentence, softens Whitman's message. He then reassures us that this relationship between the poet and the reader is not a matter of telling or imposing of any kind, but of sharing. He is not imposing his assumptions on us. Rather, he is expressing his beliefs, his ideas, his feelings, with the hope that we will share them. And this is how he comes out of the shell of individuality and encompasses universality. All men shall celebrate themselves. Okay? So the sentence that opens Song of Myself sets the tone and the mood for the rest of the poem, which alternately challenges and soothes the reader. Ultimately, the reader is reassured, soothed, that there will be a sharing, there will be a mutual give and take and understanding, and there will not be mere imposing or telling. This personal epic is not just about the individual self, therefore. Whitman, the speaker of the poem, goes out into the world. He observes his fellow Americans, chronicles their various activities. The work is filled with what has been known as Whitmanesque catalogue, a listing of all the things that people proudly do in their everyday lives. So, Song of Myself is a celebration of the diversity and richness of American life. Throughout the poem, Whitman continues expanding his experience, and the poem includes the entire diversity of the American nation. Song of Myself may begin with the assertion of personal identity, but by its end, the poet identifies with everyone and offers to help others who pass his way. So it changes from individualism to a mutual sharing, a mutual understanding, and an encompassing of the vast diversity of the American nation. The three lines that close the poem may not be as well known as those that open it, but they may be more enchanting. These are the lines: failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged, missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. These are the lines of reassurance, which reassure the reader that there will be someone waiting, there will be sharing, there will be mutual sense of empathy for each other. Now, these are some of the basic writings of American literary tradition, but then there is one major section of American literary tradition, that is slave narratives. So, like the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, another very famous American slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of Harriet Jacobs, the life of a slave girl. Incidents in the life of a slave girl. The name of the slave girl is Harriet Jacobs. It is written by Harriet Jacobs, who, however, presents himself as Linda Brenton, but and it is about the slave trade that existed, the inhuman slave system that existed in America before the Civil War. So although she gives a false name in this autobiography and also changes the names of her acquaintances, however, the story she tells is essentially true. In the book's opening sentence suggests that despite her hatred of slavery, her personal identity is inextricably linked to her status as a slave. Furthermore, the book's opening words describe or distinguish Jacobs from her contemporary readers because she becomes a slave girl while the contemporary readers are mostly white abolitionists and they cannot really understand the condition of the slave girl, the misery which she undergoes and the misery in which she is living in. And Harriet Jacobs' tone is one of quiet desperation. Now, seemingly straightforward, Jacobs' first sentence is really quite sophisticated. She says, "I was born a slave, but I never knew it till 6 years of happy childhood had passed away." Starting with her birth, it rushes past her early childhood, going beyond her 6th birthday. And then she suddenly realizes, she comes to the awful realization that she is a slave. The moment she makes this awful realization and she says this in this sentence, this reflects both her innocence and experience. She has, when she is writing this, she has become free. She has escaped from her master and she has gone to New York and she has taken up her work as a nanny in the house of Nathaniel P. Willis's family. And she has obtained her freedom and has become involved in abolitionist movement. But the harrowing experience that she has undergone as a slave, she had been locked up in a coffin-like room for years together. She had heard the voices of her children growing up, but she has never been able to see them. I mean, this kind of inhuman experiences she has been through throughout her slavery, her tenure of slavery. And so her tale of endurance is an inspiring story of one woman's unflagging efforts to circumvent the control of a master and assert her humanity and personal identity. So Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is also a story, a slave literature, which is a search for a slave girl's search for identity. And then we come to another kind of novel in American literature, that is the picaresque novel. And here we must turn to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was a sequel to Mark Twain's Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The first line of Huck Finn says that you don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of the Adventures of Tom Sawyers. But that ain't no matter. So this is the beginning. That is, Mark Twain had written first The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and as a sequel he had written Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And the beginning of Huck Finn says that if you haven't read Tom Sawyer's, then you won't be able to understand Huckleberry Finn. Now, the first novel, Tom Sawyer, had been written in the third person. Okay? But Huck Finn had been written in the first person from Huck Finn's point of view. Now, like Ishmael's Moby Dick, Huck's first sentence has an easygoing conversational tone. He defines himself in negative terms. Instead of stating who he is like Arthur Gordon Pym, Huck Finn acknowledges the reader's ignorance of him. In American English, Huck often uses vulgarism that marks him as an uneducated lower class. Yet, Huck himself has read Tom Sawyer. Also, Huck has enough savvy to create a persona of his own, a self-portrait for the reading public. See, Huck Finn is the son of a boorish drunkard who enjoy privileges just because he is a white man. Huck Finn himself also enjoys privileges because he is a white adolescent, and he shows off his privileges or his superiority over the servant Jim, both of whom escape Jim to reach freedom and make their journey down the Mississippi River, and Huck Finn to find adventure. So both of them sail off together. But Huck Finn maintains his superiority over Jim by showing his conglomeration of knowledge, which becomes a mixed bowl soup of history and British history and British drama. He doesn't know anything exact of any of these things, but he shows a tremendous knowledge of all this before Jim, and he puts up a persona of a very knowledgeable person, and very savvily recites British history before him, the French kings, the British kings, how they chopped off the heads of people and how richly they lived and everything. He narrates them as if he has read them firsthand. This is the self-confidence of the American adolescent who hasn't had the opportunity to be educated because his father doesn't want him to be educated, and father sort of mistreats the little boy and wants to take away all his money from him, and this boy wants to thwart the resistances, the restrictions of civilization, just wants to thwart every restriction of civilization, which includes education, religion, the hypocrisies of religion and everything, and just wants to find freedom in adventure, wants to lead a bohemian life. And that is how he wants to find out his identity. And so, although he puts up a persona of somebody superior before the servant Jim, but in actuality, and although he thwarts the civilizing atmosphere, the so-called fake civilization of the American nation, which is projected in the book also, he in reality shows a kind of morality and a kind of ethos which brings out true humanity for his feelings for the slave Jim and for his tremendous efforts to help Jim free himself. And how is the American folly, the folly of the aristocratic American civilization brought out in this novel? It shows two aristocratic southern families, Grangerfords and Shepherdsons, fighting each other because their children had run away and got married. Okay? And they all kill each other. The entire families kill each other. So the foolery of the aristocratic Americans is also exhibited in this novel. Okay? So thus, through various adventures, this is how Huck tries to find his identity and realizes he will be able to maintain his identity only through adventure, only through companionship with Tom Sawyer, and only through the thwarting of the fakeness of actual civilization. So then we finally come to the final novel, that is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, published in 1952, which belies its complex meaning. Here the first line is, "I am an invisible man." Ellison's narrator tells us, unlike Arthur Gordon Pym, this narrator neither provides his family name nor his given name. Unlike Ishmael, he does not ask him or tell us what to call him. His declarative sentence destabilizes the reader. Either the first-person narrator is writing a supernatural story, he has no identity, he's an invisible man. So either the first-person narrator is writing a supernatural story or he is speaking figuratively. The book's second sentence denies any supernatural associations. "No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe." The word spook is a double entendre. Besides referring to a ghost-like creatures, it has a racial slur. In Sam Greenlee's novel The Spook Who Sat by the Door, the word spook is used both as a racial slur and also to mean a CIA agent. So by saying he is not a spook, Ellison's Invisible Man denies any supernatural associations and challenges and all derogatory racial epithets. The phrase invisible man basically establishes a relationship between the nameless narrator and society. He exists in a society that does not accept his identity. Thus, absence of identity paradoxically defines the invisible man. It is his absence of identity that gives him his identity. And because of this absence of identity, he is able to merge with several other coveted identities. Like in one instance, he becomes Benjamin Franklin. In another instance, he becomes Louis Armstrong. Thus, he adopts other identities because he has no identity of his own. And then he also participates in American national identities. For example, he participates in an incident where there is a black church service going on, and suddenly there is also a gathering of community leaders to receive a college scholarship, but he is lumped together with several young black men and forced to engage in a brutal exhibition fight. And this battle royal scene possesses an almost unbearable insanity. Now in this fight, he also shows that there is a Mr. Norton, a white, and a wealthy college supporter, Jim Trueblood. Mr. Norton is a white and wealthy college supporter, and Jim Trueblood is an incestuous black sharecropper. And there is a tremendous commotion between these whites and blacks. So what really is the core of this incident is that he takes part in an American national incident of a commotion between black and white, and he thus portrays by participating in one such event not only the clash between black and white, but also the sharing and mixing the multiculturalism of black and white population. And he also shows the conglomeration of blacks and whites together in one service, in one incident, which is a part of American national identity, thus not having an identity of his own. By participating in American national events where there is a sharing of incident between black and white, he shows American national character. Okay, and in doing so, he has actually taken the instance from Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, and he anticipates Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, published in 1962. Thus, this entire situation presents another take on the issue of personal identity. That is, can people really stand apart from their social conditions? So thus, by not having an identity, he participates in social events which show the national character and through which he has to assert, or he has to show his identity. So hope you enjoyed this lecture. Hope this has proved useful. Thank you for listening to this lecture. Thank you very much, and hope you liked it.